Shut up, you nobody. President Donald J. Trump spat the words like a verdict. The studio froze. Cameras rolled, the presidential seal loomed, and in the hot white light, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett didn't even blink. She leaned in, because nobodies don't walk into live national TV holding $9 million in receipts, 7 sealed settlements, and 3 law firms' names on retainer. 38 million Americans watched, unaware they were seconds from hearing about women paid to vanish, a $104,800 Croatian youth wellness trip, and a First Lady's charity that spent $78,000 on an ice sculpture of Melania Trump, while giving $0 to real children's mental health. And in that instant, the most powerful man in the world had no idea. The nobody before him was about to make history remember her name. The air in the CBS studio felt heavier than the lights above, as if every watt was pressing down on the polished glass table between them. President Donald J. Trump shifted in his leather chair, his posture radiating the authority of a man used to ending conversations with a single glare. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't there to be dismissed. The crimson envelope in her hands was more than paper. It was a blade sharpened over years of silence, and she was about to draw it in front of 38 million witnesses. Gayle King, seated between them, sensed the tension thickening. Her opening questions about the economy and national unity were already a distant memory. The warm golden light of the set had cooled into something clinical, almost surgical. Every breath in the room felt measured. Jasmine broke the seal slowly, deliberately, the faint tear of paper amplified by the microphones. She pulled the first document free and slid it halfway across the table toward the president. Her eyes never left his. "Mr. President," she began, voice low but clear, "you promised transparency to the American people. You told them your wife's foundation was dedicated to compassion and service. This," she tapped the page once, "tells another story." The camera zoomed in. The document's header was crisp and unmistakable. Save America PAC. Beneath it, the date, November 4th, 2021. Amount, $9,000. Recipient, Melania Style Foundation. No memo line, no explanation. At the bottom, bold as the seal on the wall behind him, Donald J. Trump. A muscle twitched in his jaw, gone almost before the viewers at home could register it. He leaned back, a smirk threatening to form. "Fake news," he said flatly, but his voice carried the faint edge of something less certain. Jasmine didn't acknowledge the deflection. She laid the next sheet beside the first, a ledger. "This isn't an isolated check," she said, her tone measured. "It's part of a pattern. 7 women, 7 settlements, each handled quietly by one of 3 law firms on retainer, each funded through this foundation. And Mr. President, each while you sat in the Oval Office." Melania Trump, seated to his right, remained motionless, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the table. But Jasmine caught the subtle tightening of her fingers against the fabric of her dress, a crack in the porcelain stillness. Gayle leaned forward, her voice softer now. "Congresswoman Crockett, are you saying these were hush payments?" Jasmine didn't hesitate. "I'm not saying it," she replied. "I'm showing it." The studio's large monitor lit up, displaying a high-resolution scan of transfer records, PAC authorizations, and settlement invoices. Each line was another nail in the story the president had been telling the nation. The silence in the room wasn't polite. It was the kind that grips the air before a storm breaks. Trump's eyes flicked from the screen to Jasmine, his expression tightening. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, leaning forward as if closing the distance could reclaim control. "On the contrary, Mr. President," she said, her voice unwavering, "I know exactly what I'm talking about. And so do they." She gestured toward the cameras, to the millions leaning closer to their screens, their living rooms suddenly feeling like front-row seats in a courtroom. The red tally light above camera 1 glowed steady. The moment stretched, and in those 47 seconds, the White House, the seat of the most powerful office in the world, trembled under the weight of a truth it could no longer keep hidden. Inside the CBS studio, the gold wash of the lights made the set look almost regal, the kind of glow meant to flatter and reassure. But the air in the room had shifted. The warmth was only on the surface. Beneath it, tension coiled tight. the kind that made people's breaths shallow without realizing it. President Donald J. Trump sat back in a polished leather armchair like a monarch on loan to the public, his red tie perfectly centered, his posture carved into the shape of confidence. He smiled for the camera, but it was the kind of smile a poker player wears when he's already calculated the risk and believes the odds are on his side. Beside him, the First Lady sat with an almost statuesque stillness, her skin luminous under the studio lights, her dress a deep navy that seemed to absorb the glow rather than reflect it. She looked as though she'd been sculpted from the same marble that lined the grand halls of European palaces. Beautiful, flawless, impenetrable. Gayle King's questions began like a gentle river, flowing predictably around the contours of politics. The economy, national unity, foreign affairs, all delivered with her trademark poise. The president's answers came polished and practiced, honed by years of podiums and teleprompters. He talked of record highs, of promises kept, of enemies, foreign and domestic. Each word was neatly wrapped in the cadence of authority, the kind of delivery that reassures loyalists and frustrates critics in equal measure. The First Lady spoke sparingly when addressed, her voice soft, her tone measured, her accent adding an icy elegance to otherwise plain words. It was the illusion of control, the perfectly staged tableau. Cameras framed them like a portrait meant for history books. The leader of the free world, his wife beside him, the interviewer serving as the bridge between them and the people. Every angle, every shadow, every breath was meant to say, this is leadership. This is stability. But the truth, Jasmine Crockett knew, was far messier, and it sat just off stage, waiting for its cue. She stood behind the curtain, the gold light not quite touching her, the monitors casting a cooler glow across her face. Her eyes were locked on the image of the President and First Lady on screen, watching not their words but the micro-expressions that lived in the seconds between them. She noted the way the President's eyes narrowed fractionally when Gayle pressed a little harder, the way Melania's fingers would curl and uncurl in her lap when certain topics were broached. She'd studied these tells like a chess player memorizing an opponent's weaknesses. Tonight, those weaknesses would matter. Gayle shifted in her seat, tilting the conversation toward a softer subject, the Be Best initiative. She asked about its origins, its mission, its impact. Melania's eyes blinked once, slowly, before she answered. We help children. The media lies. My office is committed to their future. Her words fell with the smooth precision of a memorized script, each syllable clipped, each sentence sealed. Trump leaned forward slightly, his voice rising to intercept any follow-up. The radical left can't stand a strong woman like Melania. They've been attacking her from day one. It's disgraceful. His tone had sharpened just enough to signal the boundaries of acceptable questioning. The set was still bathed in gold, but the edges had started to harden. From her place in the shadows, Jasmine inhaled slowly, her hands tightening around the crimson envelope she'd brought with her. She had no notes, no teleprompter, no script. What she carried was heavier. Documents, transfers, settlements. Proof. She knew her entrance would cut across the scene like a cold front slicing through a warm summer evening. Sudden and undeniable. The timing had to be perfect, because in politics, as in war, a single second could mean the difference between a blow that lands and one that glances off. Gayle pressed again, asking about transparency in the foundation's finances. The question was gentle but pointed, the kind that left only two real options, open up or evade. Melania answered with the same cool detachment as before, and Trump followed with a sweeping dismissal about fake news and witch hunts. The exchange was smooth enough that an untrained ear might not hear the strain under it, but Jasmine heard it. The slight hitch before the denial, the micro-pause that comes when the mind races to select the safest lie. Her earpiece crackled softly. Crockett, stand by. We cut to you in 90 seconds. Her pulse didn't race. Her breathing didn't falter. The calm that settled over her was the same calm she'd felt before every hard vote on the House floor, before every cross-examination in a hearing. She wasn't coming on to ask questions. She was coming on to end the performance. On screen, the president laughed at one of his own quips, the First Lady's lips curling into a faint smile. The image was perfect. Two figures framed in authority and grace. But Jasmine knew what the audience didn't. The gold light, the smooth smiles, the practiced answers were just the frame. Tonight, she was about to show them the picture inside, and it was nothing like the portrait they'd been sold. She looked once at the envelope, then back at the monitor. The man on the screen carried the power of the presidency. The woman beside him carried the armor of silence. And yet, in less than a minute, that armor would crack, and the weight of what was inside her hands would make the presidential seal behind them feel less like a symbol of authority and more like the backdrop to a trial. When the cue finally came, Jasmine didn't step forward immediately. She waited half a beat, enough for the viewers at home to lean in, sensing the shift without knowing why. Then she moved. The gold light touched her now, but it didn't soften her. It sharpened her. And as the cameras adjusted to her presence, the air in the studio shifted once again, this time not from warmth to chill, but from illusion to reckoning. Gayle King sensed it too, the way the atmosphere changed as if someone had cracked open a door to a room no one was supposed to enter. She held her next card just a moment longer, her eyes moving between the president, the first lady, and the congresswoman now standing at the edge of the frame. Then she turned her attention back to Melania. Her voice was steady, pleasant, but with the kind of subtle weight that makes the question harder to sidestep. "Mrs. Trump," Gayle began, "your foundation has been praised for its work with children, but critics have raised concerns about transparency. How do you respond to that?" For a moment, Melania didn't move. She blinked once, a slow, deliberate motion, before delivering her answer with the smooth detachment of someone who has practiced it many times before. "We help children. The media lies. My office is committed to their future." Her accent clipped the edges of the words, adding a faint sharpness, like glass catching light. She didn't elaborate, didn't explain. The sentence sat there, perfect and cold. Before Gayle could push further, President Trump leaned forward slightly, his voice cutting in like a blade through the air. "The radical left attacks her because she's successful," he said, his tone carrying the kind of feigned outrage that's designed for headlines. "It's disgusting. They can't stand a woman who does good and does it well." Off stage, Jasmine's fingers tightened around the crimson envelope until she could feel the thick paper edges pressing into her skin. She'd heard this kind of preemptive defense before, a shield made of sentiment, a quick pivot to victimhood before the facts could even breathe. But she also knew that in less than 60 seconds, that shield was going to crack, and not under the weight of opinion, but under the weight of receipts. Gayle's pen hovered just above her notepad. "But the financial filings, Mr. President," she began, but he cut her off again with a dismissive wave. "Fake news. We've been transparent from day one. The numbers are out there, but the media twists them. That's what they do." Jasmine stepped forward another inch, just close enough to feel the heat of the studio lights. Her eyes didn't leave the president, but she could see Melania in her peripheral vision. Unmoving, unreadable, but with that same small tension in her hands she'd noticed earlier. In the world of politics, the absence of movement is rarely neutrality. It's often calculation. Her earpiece crackled softly. "Cutting to you in 30, Gayle tried again, her tone shifting just enough to carry the edge of insistence. "Mrs. Trump, your foundation has reported millions in donations, but there have been no public records of direct aid to children's programs in the last fiscal year. Can you—" "We help children," Melania repeated, her voice cooler this time, as if the repetition itself was the answer. Jasmine exhaled slowly, steadying herself for what she was about to do. The gold light didn't just illuminate now. It felt like it was carving space, clearing a path for her entrance. Her thumb brushed over the embossed seal on the envelope, the texture familiar, the weight undeniable. Every document inside had been verified twice. Every number cross-checked. Every date matched to the exact moment a story in the shadows had ended in silence. 10 seconds. The president's hand rested on the arm of his chair, his fingers tapping once, twice, a rhythm too controlled to be unconscious. He glanced briefly toward the control room glass, as if to check who was in charge of the cut button. 5. Jasmine moved fully into the frame. The shift was subtle on camera, But in the room, it was like the temperature dropped a few degrees. Gail's eyes flicked toward her, but didn't break from her role. The viewers at home wouldn't know it yet, but the next voice they heard wasn't going to belong to the president or the first lady or even Gail King. 2. The cut happened in a blink, the split screen fading to Jasmine Crockett, standing center stage, navy blazer sharp against the gold backdrop, hair pulled back to expose eyes that were steady, almost surgical in their focus. She didn't glance at the monitor, didn't look at Gail for a cue. Her gaze was locked on the man sitting in the leather armchair, the most powerful man in the world. And when she spoke, her voice was calm, but it landed like a gavel. "Actually, Gail," she said, lifting the crimson envelope just high enough for the cameras to catch it, "I have the documents the president says don't exist." The sentence hit the room like a drop of ink in clear water, spreading fast, impossible to take back. The president's smile twitched, just barely, but enough for millions at home to notice. Melania's eyes shifted for the first time, dropping to the envelope in Jasmine's hand before returning to the middle distance. Jasmine stepped forward, the lights catching the faint sheen of the seal before she broke it with a deliberate tear. $9 million, she began. 7 women, 3 law firms, 1 signature. She held the envelope open, the edge of a document peeking out like the first glimpse of a storm cloud over a bright horizon. The studio was silent now. Not the comfortable silence of polite listening, but the electric, suspended kind that precedes a collision. And somewhere, deep beneath the gold light and marble-carved poise, the first hairline fracture had appeared in the wall the president thought would never break. Gail King leaned forward slightly, her pen still in her hand, but her attention locked on the man in the leather armchair. Her voice was even, almost gentle, but the question was a loaded round wrapped in velvet. "Mr. President, can you explain a $9 million payment to an organization linked to your wife?" Trump's smile didn't vanish, but it changed. The curve at the corners stiffened, the warmth behind it evaporating. "Fake news," he said, the 2 words spat out with the muscle memory of countless rallies and interviews. His hand gave a small, dismissive wave, as if brushing away a gnat. But before Gail could press, the live feed shifted without warning. On millions of television screens across America, the image split, then reformed into something no one expected. Jasmine Crockett, live, clear, in frame. She was no longer on the periphery, no longer an offstage presence. Now she was front and center, navy blazer catching the light, hair pulled back, her gaze locked straight into the lens as if she were looking into every living room in the country at once. "Actually, Gail," her voice was steady, unhurried, but it carried the precision of a scalpel. She lifted the crimson envelope, letting the camera drink in the seal before she continued. "I have the documents the president pretends don't exist." The words dropped into the studio like a stone into still water. The ripples were instant. Somewhere off camera, a producer's sharp inhale was barely caught by the boom mic. The control room, usually a hive of murmured commands and quick cuts, went still for a heartbeat, then let it roll. The choice was deliberate. This wasn't going to be contained. The president shifted in his chair, leaning forward now, one elbow resting on the armrest, his gaze fixed on Jasmine with an intensity that could have drilled through steel. "This is a setup," he said, the words measured, but with a tautness in his jaw that betrayed the strain under the surface. Jasmine stepped forward, closing the space between her and the glass table that separated her from the president. She didn't look at him when she spoke. She looked at the documents as if they were the only thing that mattered. $9 million transferred from Save America PAC to the Melania Style Foundation. No memo, no earmarked purpose. And within 72 hours of that transfer, 3 separate legal settlements paid to women with signed NDAs, each handled by one of 3 law firms retained by this administration. Gail's head turned from Jasmine to the president and back again. The silence between each sentence felt like it was made of lead. Viewers at home could almost hear the weight of it pressing against the walls of the room. Melania Trump, seated beside her husband, didn't move. Her posture remained as rigid as when the night began. But Jasmine noticed, and millions would later replay, the way her eyes flicked toward the envelope, then away, as though it were a light too bright to look at directly. Trump leaned back, lips parting as if to retort, but Jasmine cut in, her tone still calm, still surgical. Mr. President, you've told the American people that your wife's foundation is a force for good. So explain to them, why are its largest disbursements tied not to children's programs, but to legal silence? It wasn't a question meant for an answer. It was meant to be seen hanging in the air, a live wire no one wanted to touch. The president's fingers drummed once against the table, a slow, deliberate rhythm. You have no idea what you're talking about, he said finally, his voice lower now, the pitch controlled, but the edge unmistakable. On the contrary, Jasmine replied, lifting the first document from the envelope and placing it flat on the table for the cameras. I know exactly what I'm talking about, and now so does the country. The studio's overhead camera zoomed in on the page. Across the bottom in bold ink was the unmistakable signature, Donald J. Trump. The image was transmitted instantly into living rooms, phones, and laptops across America, frozen in high definition. Gail broke the silence. Mr. President, this appears to be your signature on a check for $9 million. Is that correct? Trump's jaw flexed. It's legal. Everything is legal. The fake media twist this because they can't stand success. But the words lack the booming confidence he carried into rallies. Tonight, each syllable was being weighed in real time against the paper now lying under studio lights. Jasmine leaned back just slightly, not in retreat, but in the way a boxer leans back before throwing the next punch. This isn't about politics, she said, eyes never leaving his. It's about 7 women who were paid to vanish. It's about a Croatian resort billed as a youth wellness program, a trip that cost $142,800, and a First Lady's charity that spent $78,000 on an ice sculpture of her face, while sending $0 to actual children's mental health. The camera cut to the president, whose expression had settled into something between defiance and calculation. Melania remained still, but her hand, the one without the glove, curled tighter against her lap. Jasmine let the silence work for her. She didn't fill it. She simply placed the next document on the table, the edges perfectly aligned with the first. You told the American people you believed in transparency. I'm here to give it to them. The red tally light burned on. The feed didn't cut. And across the country, in kitchens and living rooms and crowded bars, people leaned forward. Not because they were told to, but because they couldn't look away. Jasmine stepped forward, the heels of her shoes making the faintest click against the studio floor. The kind of sound that's nothing on its own, but in a room holding its breath, it lands like a drum beat. She broke the crimson seal on the envelope with deliberate slowness, the paper tearing in a way that the microphones seemed to amplify. Out came the first sheet, thick stock, the kind reserved for official transactions, not personal notes. She laid it on the glass table between her and the president, careful to angle it toward the nearest camera. Bank transfer, she said evenly, from Save America Passy to the Melania Style Foundation. $9 million. She tapped the date with her finger. 3 days later, a private NDA settlement with a former White House intern. The president's posture, until now relaxed in a calculated display of control, tightened almost imperceptibly. His shoulders drew in, his chin lifted, and the smirk that had been his shield began to thin. To his right, the First Lady's gaze, which had stayed fixed and impassive through the earlier questions, dropped for the first time, just for a second, toward the paper in front of her. It was enough. Jasmine reached back into the envelope and pulled another sheet, sliding it next to the first so the two formed a single, damning spread. This one wasn't a check. It was a Passy authorization document, stamped with internal routing codes and signed off by a senior campaign finance officer. Every cent of that $9 million passed through this authorization, she said, approved by people in this administration during this presidency. She let the word "this" linger just long enough to make it clear she meant now, not some distant past. Gayle King glanced from the documents to the president. Mr. President, are you saying these transfers did not occur? Trump didn't answer right away. His eyes scanned the table as if searching for the angle of attack, a way to spin what was already sitting in plain view. Finally, he said, "It's legal. We've done everything by the book. This is nothing but a smear job by..." Jasmine's voice cut in, sharper than before. Legal doesn't mean ethical, legal doesn't mean moral, and legal doesn't erase the fact that this money was tied directly to silencing individuals who posed a personal threat to you, not a threat to the country. A murmur ran through the control room, though the sound never reached the broadcast. The overhead camera zoomed tighter on the signatures. Donald J. Trump in the same black ink, on both the PAC transfer and the settlement cover sheet. She reached for the third document. This one was thicker, a contract with a law firm known for high-profile damage control. The header read, Confidential Settlement Agreement, Non-Disclosure Clause Enforced. Jasmine placed it directly on top of the others, fanning the three slightly so the camera could catch each heading. Same date, same law firm, same pattern, over and over again. Melania's hands shifted in her lap, one glove brushing over the other. It was small, subtle, but Jasmine's eyes caught it. The stillness that had been her armor was beginning to show signs of strain. Trump leaned forward, palms on the table now. This is a disgrace. You're dragging my family through the mud on live television for cheap political points. No, Jasmine replied, her tone steady but carrying an undercurrent that could cut steel. I'm showing the American people what's been happening behind their backs, while you sit in the highest office in this country. The room seemed to grow smaller, the space between them shrinking in the eyes of the viewers. The contrast was stark. The president, visibly agitated, leaning in as if force could reclaim control. The congresswoman, calm but unyielding, the pile of documents in front of her growing like a physical embodiment of her case. Gail looked down at her notepad, then back up. Congresswoman Crockett, what do you believe these documents prove? Jasmine didn't miss a beat. That the Commander-in-Chief of the United States authorized a flow of money from political coffers into a private foundation run by the First Lady, and that those funds were used in part to pay for legal silence. That includes an NDA signed by a former White House staffer just days after this check cleared. The words Commander-in-Chief seemed to hang in the air longer than the rest. In any other room, with any other audience, they might have been just a title. But here, under these lights, in this moment, they sounded like an indictment. Trump's mouth opened to fire back, but the timing wasn't his anymore. Jasmine was already reaching for the fourth piece of paper, an itemized invoice from a luxury resort in Croatia. And this, she said, sliding it onto the stack, was billed as a youth wellness initiative. Total cost, $142,800. 3 guests, initials matching NDA recipients. Paid for in full by the Melania Style Foundation, the same account that received this $9 million transfer. Melania's eyes flicked up again, this time toward Jasmine. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't even anger. It was something quieter, heavier, recognition. This is the pattern, Jasmine continued, her tone still, even but sharper with every sentence. Money moves from political accounts to the foundation. The foundation disperses funds to law firms, settlements, and occasionally lavish retreats labeled as charity. The public sees the headline, not the ledger. Until now. The red tally light burned on. The documents lay between them like evidence on a courtroom table. And somewhere, beyond the camera's frame, the idea of untouchable power was starting to look like just another story waiting to be rewritten. Jasmine's hand moved again, but this time she wasn't reaching for more contracts or bank transfers. From the crimson envelope, she drew a thinner stack, photographs. She spread them carefully, one by one, across the table, aligning the edges until they formed a silent lineup under the glare of the studio lights. The first face looked out at the camera with tired eyes and a faint, brittle smile. Maria Delson, Jasmine said quietly, Senior Event Coordinator, Trump White House, 2017 to 2019. She tapped the second photo, a woman in a crisp blazer, her hair pulled into a professional bun. Sandra Lee, Social Media Director, 2015 to 2018. The third and fourth photos followed. Tiffany Groves and Dina Cow. All four signed non-disclosure agreements after receiving settlements paid from the Melania Style Foundation. All four left their positions abruptly. None have spoken publicly since. Trump's gaze flicked down at the photos, then back to Jasmine, his jaw clenched but his mouth unmoving. Melania's eyes remained fixed on the table, though her posture had stiffened by an almost imperceptible degree. Jasmine could feel the weight of 38 million viewers leaning in from their couches, their kitchens, the bars where this broadcast was playing on wall-mounted TVs. She laid down the fifth and sixth photos, women with different jobs, different lives, but the same silent end to their stories. Every single one of them signed during your presidency, Jasmine continued, her voice steady. Every single one had legal representation provided by one of the three law firms already named in these documents. And every single one disappeared from public view within days of their settlements clearing. Then she held the seventh photo for a moment before placing it down. It was different. Not a polished headshot or a work photo, but a candid, the kind that might have been taken on a phone. A young woman with a wide smile, her hair loose around her shoulders, sunlight catching in her eyes. Rachel Morelli, Jasmine said, her tone shifting to something quieter, heavier. White House intern. Her NDA was drafted but never signed. She died 2 days later, 26 years old. The camera lingered on Rachel's face, the image frozen on millions of screens. The silence in the studio was no longer just tension. It was grief pressing into every corner of the room. Gail's voice broke it, soft but steady. Do you have any evidence connecting these women to the payments we've seen tonight? Jasmine didn't hesitate. Yes. She reached for a sheet from the envelope, a single page marked with columns of names, dates, and wire transfer IDs. She placed it in the center of the table, directly above Rachel's photo. All 7 are here. Each name corresponds to a transfer from the foundation within 72 hours of their departure. The amounts vary, but the timeline does not, and every one of them coincides with the legal services billed by the same firms already in our evidence stack. Trump shifted in his seat, the leather creaking under the movement. You don't know the circumstances of those departures, he said, his voice sharpening. You don't know their reasons. Jasmine looked at him, her gaze unwavering. I know the cost, she said. And so does every woman whose face is on this table. The cost was silence. The close-up camera moved slowly down the row of photographs, each face now part of the record in a way that settlements and NDAs had tried to erase. Maria, Sandra, Tiffany, Dina, 2 more whose names until now had lived only in sealed files, and Rachel, the one who never signed, the one whose story would never be told in her own voice. Melania's fingers tightened slightly in her lap. If the camera caught it, viewers would see only a subtle movement, but to Jasmine, it was the first visible crack in the First Lady's marble stillness. Mr. President, Gail asked, turning back to Trump, were these women paid to ensure they would not speak about personal conduct during your administration? No, Trump said quickly, his tone carrying more force than calm. They were compensated fairly for their work and treated with respect. This is a disgraceful ambush. This isn't an ambush, Jasmine replied, her voice low but edged with steel. This is daylight, and daylight doesn't need permission to shine. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The power was in the arrangement before them. The stack of signed documents, the matching dates and wire transfers. The photos of 7 women who had vanished from the public eye. It was in the way the evidence spoke without her having to embellish or dramatize. The red tally light stayed on. No one in the control room called for a cut. The image of the table, half covered in papers, half covered in faces, filled the nation's screens. In that moment, the Oval Office wasn't miles away. It was right here, condensed into a glass table under studio lights, its walls stripped down to numbers, signatures, and the human cost of both. Jasmine didn't pause to savor the silence. She reached back into the crimson envelope and drew out something different. A high-gloss, full-color brochure. The cover gleamed under the lights. A white stone resort perched on a cliffside, turquoise waves curling beneath it. Sunlight so pristine, it looked almost artificial. Across the front, embossed in gold foil, were the words, "The Haven at Narrate Cliffs, a place for silence, serenity, and healing." She held it up for the cameras, tilting it slightly so the gold letters caught the light. This, she began, was billed as a youth mental health outreach initiative under the Melania Style Foundation. She set it down next to Rachel Morelli's photograph, her fingers smoothing it flat against the glass. It cost $142,800. 3 guests, 7 nights, spa access, chartered flights, and full resort buyout. She let the words breathe for a moment, scanning the president's face. His expression was unreadable, but his right hand, resting on the table's edge, had stilled completely. The names on the guest registry, Jasmine continued, sliding a second document from the envelope, are recorded as initials only. But these initials, she tapped the paper, match the settlements we've already identified. The overhead camera zoomed in. There they were. MD. SL, TG. 3 letters repeated in the order of arrival, departure, and billing. The same 3 women who'd signed NDAs in the weeks following the $9 million transfer. They weren't sent for healing, Jasmine said, her voice tightening. They were sent to vanish, with Air Force One on the tarmac. The sentence landed like a blow. Somewhere in the control room, a producer mouthed, "Oh my God," without realizing the camera above the studio floor could see them. Gail broke the tension, her tone careful. "Congresswoman Crockett, are you saying these trips were funded under the guise of charity, but served another purpose?" Jasmine didn't look away from the president. "I'm saying the purpose was disappearance. No media, no photos, no witnesses. A full buyout of the resort's West Wing for the duration of the stay, with full discretion noted in the concierge's own internal memo." She slid that memo forward next, its header stamped confidential, client request. The text was stark. No photography, no outside bookings. All staff briefed on privacy protocols. Below that, in smaller type, per instruction of Mr. Trump's representative. Melania's gaze flickered, almost imperceptibly, toward the memo before returning to the middle distance. Jasmine caught it. So did the cameras. Trump's voice finally cut in. "This is absurd. The First Lady supports wellness programs all over the world. You're twisting a humanitarian effort into some kind of—" "Mr. President," Jasmine interrupted, her tone calm but impenetrable. "Show me one child's name on that guest list. Show me one program report. Show me one follow-up on how this $142,800 advanced youth mental health." She placed both hands on the table, leaning just enough to close the space between them. "You can't, because it didn't. The brochure, the memo, the guest list, they lay there like puzzle pieces finely joined. The image they formed wasn't the glossy cliffside paradise of the cover. It was a shadowed, locked-door retreat where silence wasn't the treatment, it was the currency." Gail's pen hovered over her notepad, her eyes flicking between them. "Mr. President, the guest list matches NDA recipients. The payment came directly from the foundation. How do you respond to that?" "Coincidence," Trump said quickly, his tone clipped. "Pure coincidence. We do good work, and you're trying to tear it down." Jasmine straightened, not taking her eyes off him. Good work doesn't hide its participants behind initials. Good work doesn't require NDAs, and good work doesn't use a charity as a vault for legal hush money. She reached into the envelope again, pulling out a printout of the wire confirmation for the resort payment. Same account, same month, same 3 sets of initials. It's not coincidence, it's a system. The red tally light burned on, and the control room still didn't cut away. The silence from the First Lady was louder than any defense her husband could muster. Her stillness, once an image of composure, now felt like an unwilling acknowledgement. Jasmine placed the resort photo atop the pile of documents and photographs. "These women were removed from the public eye under the banner of compassion," she said. "But compassion doesn't require secrecy. It doesn't require removing every trace of a person's existence from the official record." She turned her gaze back to Melania, holding it just long enough for the cameras to frame them both. "Mrs. Trump, was this your idea of outreach?" Melania blinked once, twice, but she said nothing. The gold light that had once flattered now seemed to expose every line of tension in her face. Jasmine stepped back, letting the evidence sit in the center of the table like a fire no one dared put out. "This isn't about gossip. It's about governance. It's about the use of political funds for personal protection and the human cost of the silence it buys." No one moved, No one breathed loudly enough for the microphones to catch. And outside the studio, in living rooms and bars and on glowing phone screens, millions of Americans now saw the Cliffside Resort not as a place for healing, but as a place where truth was sent to die. Jasmine didn't rush her next move. She reached into the inner pocket of her blazer and drew out something small, almost inconspicuous, a black flash drive no bigger than her thumb. She held it between two fingers, letting it catch the light for a moment before speaking. "Numbers are one thing," she said, her voice steady, "but sometimes the truth has a voice of its own." Gail's brow furrowed, sensing the shift. The president's gaze tracked the flash drive like it was a live grenade. Melania didn't look at it directly, but the subtle tension in her jaw told Jasmine she knew exactly what was coming. Jasmine walked to the edge of the table where a technician waited, his hands hovering over the control deck. Without ceremony, she placed the drive in his palm. "Play file 1, she instructed. The technician's nod was almost imperceptible. The studio lights dimmed slightly as the giant screen behind the interview chairs came to life. The image that appeared was grainy, handheld, the telltale jitter of a phone camera. The timestamp in the corner read March 2018. The location, an opulent dressing room lined with gilded mirrors, the kind reserved for gala events and high-profile appearances. Melania Trump sat before a vanity, her hair half-pinned, a makeup artist adjusting a stray strand. She wore a satin robe the color of champagne. Off to the side, an aide leaned against the wall, speaking to her in Slovenian. Melania laughed, a sharp, almost dry sound that didn't reach her eyes. Then she said the words, "I just play the part until he dies. It's not about love. It's about legacy." The translation burned in stark white letters at the bottom of the screen, timed perfectly to her voice. The studio seemed to constrict around the sound, the silence from the audience so absolute that even the faint hum of the lights felt deafening. The president's jaw locked instantly, his lips pressing into a thin, bloodless line. Melania's stillness, already calculated and polished, hardened into something else entirely. It wasn't the poise of a first lady now. It was a second silence, the dangerous kind that isn't about elegance but about control. Jasmine didn't turn to watch the screen. She kept her eyes on the president, measuring the twitch of his hands, the slight flare in his nostrils. She knew he was calculating. Not whether to deny it, but how fast he could call it a fake. And right on cue, when the clip ended and the screen froze on Melania's reflection in the mirror, Trump's voice cut the air. "Fake," he said, the word barked rather than spoken. "Deep fake. This is fabricated garbage." But the denial came too fast, too rehearsed. It landed wrong, and the viewers at home knew it. Jasmine stepped closer to the table, her voice low but unwavering. "That audio has been verified by 2 independent linguists in a forensic audio lab. It was recorded backstage before the UNICEF Gala in New York. 3 separate witnesses placed you there, Mrs. Trump. The words are yours." Melania's eyes didn't move. She stared at the screen behind Jasmine, her own face frozen in that mirror image, the white translation blazing beneath it. Gail leaned forward, her pen forgotten in her hand. "Mrs. Trump," she asked carefully, "do you stand by those words?" The pause was long enough to feel like a crack in the broadcast. Melania blinked once, then twice, but she didn't speak. Jasmine let the silence stretch, her gaze moving from Melania back to the president. "You've both sold an image to this country," she said, "a marriage built on partnership, a foundation built on compassion. But your own words, Mrs. Trump, tell us it's about none of those things. It's about survival." "Yours." Trump's hand came down on the armrest of his chair with a dull thud. "This is disgusting," he snapped. "You're attacking my wife on live TV." "I'm holding you accountable," Jasmine cut in, her voice sharp enough to slice through his sentence. "Accountability doesn't care about the setting." The screen behind them still showed the frozen frame from the clip. Melania looking into the mirror, her expression distant, detached, as if already living outside the moment. The juxtaposition was brutal. On one side of the table, the living woman. On the other, the recorded confession. Gail's eyes flicked to the monitor in the control room. She could see the feeds from across the country. news channels already clipping the footage, social media posts firing off like sparks into dry brush. The words "I just play the part until he dies" were already becoming a headline. Melania's silence had weight now. It wasn't the silence of restraint. It was the silence of someone who knew that anything she said could turn a controlled burn into an inferno. Jasmine finally turned to look at the screen. "Legacy," she said softly, almost to herself. "If this is what you call legacy, the American people deserve to see it without the gold frame you've put around it." Trump's face had reddened, the heat crawling up his neck. His voice, when it came, was tight. "You think you're clever, but this is all political theater." "No," Jasmine said, her tone measured, deliberate. "Theater requires actors. This," she gestured to the screen, "isn't acting. It's truth caught on tape." The red tally light still burned. The flash drive still sat on the table between them. And across the country, millions of viewers had already made up their minds about what they just heard. Whether the First Lady was a prisoner of her own role or an architect of the silence that protected it. "Fake!" The word tore from President Trump's mouth like a shot, loud enough to make the sound engineer flinch. He leaned forward, hands gripping the arms of his chair, his eyes locked on Jasmine with the kind of fury meant to bulldoze opposition into silence. But this time, the force of his voice didn't move her. Jasmine didn't blink. She reached into the envelope once more, sliding out a crisp white document. Not a check, not a photo, but a dense sheet of technical printouts. She placed it on the table between them with slow precision, the way an attorney places an exhibit before the jury. "This," she said calmly, "is the metadata report for that footage." The president didn't look down at first. His gaze stayed fixed on her, as if willing her to fold under the heat of his stare. But the cameras had already adjusted, zooming in on the page. In the upper right corner, the seal was unmistakable. The official White House archive stamp, complete with date of classification. Beneath it, in stark black font, device ID, WCAM 1422. Location tag, West Wing Press Room 3. The recorded date, February 21st, 2018. "If it's fake," Jasmine said evenly, her voice carrying through the studio like a thread of steel, "why is it stored on your own servers?" The question hung in the air, heavier than anything she'd said all night. Gayle King glanced at the monitor, her pen frozen over her notepad. Even Melania's eyes shifted toward the paper, the faintest flicker of recognition passing through them before she caught herself and looked away. Trump's lips pressed into a thin line. "We have thousands of files in our system," he said finally, his tone clipped. "We can't monitor every single one. Someone planted it." Jasmine tilted her head slightly, as though considering the answer, but her eyes never left his. "So you're telling the American people that an unverified fabricated video of the First Lady sat on an official White House device for 5 years. And no one noticed?" The studio lights seemed to grow hotter, the air heavier. Trump shifted in his seat, leaning back now, his fingers tapping once against the armrest. "I'm saying," he replied, "that you're twisting this for political gain." Jasmine didn't react to the jab. Instead, she reached forward and tapped the highlighted section at the bottom of the report. "This line," she said, letting the camera catch the exact spot, "shows the original upload location, West Wing Internal Media Prep Server. That means it didn't come from outside, it came from within." For the first time, Trump broke eye contact. His gaze flicked toward Melania, then to the control room glass, then back to Jasmine. It was only a second, but it was enough for the viewers at home to feel it. The shift from offense to defense. "Mr. President," Gayle's voice was careful but edged, "this metadata indicates the footage was recorded by your own media team. Are you saying they were part of some conspiracy against you?" Trump exhaled sharply, the sound closer to a scoff than a laugh. "I'm saying there are a lot of people who would love to undermine this administration." Jasmine leaned forward, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table. "Then tell us their name," she said. "Tell the American people who in your inner circle you believe is capable of fabricating your wife's voice and hiding it on your own servers for half a decade." The challenge was plain, but he didn't take it. His silence now was different from Melania's. Hers was calculated stillness. His was the silence of a man searching for an exit. Jasmine let the moment stretch, then straightened, addressing not him but the camera. This report wasn't obtained from a leak. It wasn't hacked. It was provided through a lawful oversight request to the National Archives. Every page is authenticated, and the reason we have it is simple. No one thought anyone would be bold enough to ask. Her words hit harder than a raised voice ever could. They weren't an accusation. They were a statement of fact, one that viewers could verify with their own eyes on the screen. The red tally light didn't waver. The paper stayed in the center of the frame, the official seal like a watermark of legitimacy. Melania remained still, but her gloved hand had moved from her lap to the edge of the table, fingertips just touching the glass as if testing its stability. Her eyes stayed fixed ahead, but the weight of the evidence in front of her was undeniable. Trump finally leaned back, his smile returning. But it wasn't the confident grin of earlier. It was thinner now, stretched tight, more a mask than an expression. "You're going to regret this," he said, the tone low enough to make it unclear if it was meant for Jasmine, the audience, or himself. Jasmine didn't flinch. "The only people who regret the truth," she replied, "are the ones it exposes." The screen behind them froze on the metadata report, the highlighted lines glowing faintly under the studio lights. And across the country, Americans were no longer wondering whether the footage was real. They were wondering why, if it was fake, the White House had kept it locked away. Jasmine let the silence linger just long enough for the image to sear itself into the minds of everyone watching. Then she shifted. Her voice softened, losing none of its strength but trading sharp edges for something deeper, heavier. "I didn't come here tonight to score political points," she began, her eyes leaving the president for the first time and turning directly to the camera, speaking to the millions watching at home. "I came here because I know what silence costs." Her gaze didn't waver. "I know because I watched it take my mother." The studio seemed to inhale as one, the temperature in the room changing again. No longer the chill of confrontation, but the weight of something personal and raw. Jasmine's voice stayed steady, but the cadence slowed, each word measured. "I was 7 years old. My mother was 34. She worked 2 jobs, paid every bill she could, and when her lungs started filling with fluid, she still went to work. One day she couldn't make it. I sat with her in a crowded county clinic, plastic chairs sticking to the backs of our legs, the air smelling like bleach and stale coffee. She could barely breathe. When our number was finally called, the receptionist looked at her chart, flipped a page and said her Medicaid paperwork was incomplete. Jasmine's hand rested lightly on the table now, not on the documents, but flat against the glass as if grounding herself. My mother said she'd submitted the updates. She had the confirmation letter in her purse. The woman behind the desk didn't even check, just said, "You'll need to reapply or pay in full." Her eyes flicked briefly toward the president before returning to the camera. "We didn't have the money, so we went home. And 2 weeks later, my mother collapsed in our kitchen and never stood up again." No one in the studio moved. Even Gail's pen was still, hovering above her notepad as if writing would break the moment. "The death certificate said pneumonia," Jasmine continued, her tone tightening just enough to hold back what threatened to crack through. "But that's not what killed her. It was a system that saw her life as paperwork, that saw her pain as an inconvenience, that made a choice to stay silent rather than fix what they knew was wrong." She looked down for a heartbeat, not in weakness, but in control. The kind of pause that lets the words sink in where they belong. "The last thing my mother said to me before she closed her eyes for the last time was this: they respect silence, but they fear justice." The phrase hung in the air like a verdict. The cameras caught the faintest ripple of movement in the audience beyond the stage, a shift in posture, a tightening of jaws. Jasmine straightened, her hands returning to the documents, her tone sharpening again. "And tonight, justice means standing toe-to-toe with the most powerful man on earth and not blinking. It means showing every person who's been told to be quiet, to be polite, to let it go, that you do not have to accept silence as your sentence." Trump shifted in his seat, his eyes narrowing as though trying to decide whether to cut in or wait. He chose to speak. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, the words careful, almost too careful. "But that has nothing to do with—" "It has everything to do with this," Jasmine cut in, her voice rising just enough to slice over his. Because this is the same playbook. Whether it's a government office or the Oval Office, whether it's a clerk behind a desk or a president behind a podium, the strategy is the same. Drown the truth in paperwork, bury it under procedure, and wrap it in the kind of silence you think no one will challenge. She let her hand fall on the stack of evidence in front of her, the papers fanning slightly under the weight. I'm here to challenge it, and I'm not alone. Her eyes swept the studio, over Gail, over the cameras, over the crew behind the glass. This isn't just about the 7 women in these photos. It's about every person who has been told to take their settlement and disappear. Every voice that's been bought, every truth that's been boxed up and hidden in archives with the hope that no one will ever open the file. Gail spoke quietly, almost as if not to break the rhythm. Congresswoman Crockett, are you saying you see yourself in these women? Jasmine nodded once, the movement small but certain. Yes, the details are different, the stakes are different, but the message they were given, that their silence was worth more than their dignity, is the same. My mother's life was treated that way. These women's lives were treated that way, and I refuse to let that be the legacy we leave behind. She turned back to Trump, her voice cooling, but her eyes burning. So no, Mr. President, this isn't just political, it's personal. And I will keep making it personal until silence is no longer the most valuable currency in this building. The red tally light still glowed. The metadata report was still on the table. And now, layered over it, was a story that couldn't be refuted with fake news or brushed aside as partisanship, because it wasn't abstract. It had a face, it had a name, it had a history, and it was sitting right there, refusing to be silent. Jasmine didn't let the air settle. Her hand dipped into the side pocket of her blazer and came out holding something new. A small, silver-cased recorder, its red indicator light faint but alive. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she placed it on the table between her and the president, pressing the play button without breaking eye contact. The sound that emerged wasn't a speech or an interview. It was the unmistakable murmur of a private room. Faint jazz music in the background, the muffled clink of crystal glasses, the low hum of expensive conversation. And then, clear as if she were sitting in the studio, came Ivanka Trump's voice. She knew. She handled it all. Daddy didn't even have to ask. The words were casual, almost amused. They landed heavier than any accusation Jasmine could have crafted herself. The audio continued, the faint shift of someone adjusting in a chair, a wine glass tapping against marble. The best cover, Ivanka went on, her voice smooth and deliberate, is a cause, and the best silence is soft. Trump's face hardened instantly, his eyes narrowing into something between fury and disbelief. Melania didn't move, but her breathing changed, subtle, quicker, as though trying to keep pace with the sudden acceleration of events. Gail's pen was no longer in her hand. She'd set it down without realizing it, her attention locked on the sound spilling into the room. Jasmine didn't speak over it. She let Ivanka's voice fill the space, the contrast between the elegant setting and the content of the words making the betrayal sharper. In homes across America, people leaned closer to their TVs, recognizing the voice that had so often been a calm, polished extension of the president's public image, now speaking like an insider at a private table. The president's attorney was the first to move. The studio doors banged open so hard the sound startled the boom operator. A tall man in a dark suit, his face flushed and his breathing uneven, stormed in holding a single sheet of paper aloft like a weapon. "Cease and desist," he barked, his voice cracking with urgency. "Cut the feed now." The control room didn't move. No button was pressed. The red tally light burned on. Trump turned sharply toward the attorney. "How the hell did they—" But he didn't finish the question. He knew. Everyone in the room knew. This wasn't some anonymous leak from a shadowy source. This was his daughter's voice, recorded without her knowledge, speaking truths that could not be unsaid. Jasmine finally spoke, her tone calm but carrying the force of inevitability. "This recording has already been mirrored to over 24 servers worldwide. Even if you cut the feed now, it's already public." She glanced briefly toward the attorney, then back to the president. "This moment is bigger than your legal threats. The attorney's hand shook slightly as he held the paper out toward the nearest producer, but no one in the booth reached for it. They were locked in too, unwilling, or unable, to break the chain reaction already in motion. Ivanka's voice came through the speakers one last time, softer now, almost like a confession meant only for the person across the table from her. Daddy didn't even have to ask. She just handled it. Then the recording clicked off. The silence that followed was different from any that had come before. Not the charged pause before a blow, not the deliberate withholding of a polished politician, but the stunned, unblinking quiet that follows when the betrayal comes from inside the family. Trump's face was a mask of control cracking at the edges. His eyes darted briefly to Melania, then to the pile of documents, then to Jasmine. "You think this proves anything?" he said, his voice low but shaking just enough for the microphones to catch. "You think a private conversation taken out of context changes the truth?" Jasmine's answer came without hesitation. "No," she said. "It confirms it." She tapped the stack of evidence still on the table. The bank transfers, the guest lists, the settlement agreements. "The paper trail told us what? This told us who made sure it stayed buried." Gail looked down at her notes, then back up, her eyes wider than they'd been all night. "Mr. President, are you saying your daughter's words are being misinterpreted?" Trump's jaw tightened. "I'm saying my daughter would never—" "Mr. President," Jasmine cut in, "your daughter's words speak for themselves, and the American people are hearing them right now, unedited." In living rooms across the country, viewers were already pulling out their phones, searching for the clip, replaying Ivanka's voice on loop, pairing it with headlines, flooding social media with quotes. The phrase "the best cover is a cause" was trending before the studio even realized it. The attorney stepped closer to Trump, leaning in to whisper something that didn't carry to the microphones. Trump nodded once, his face hardening again, but the damage was already done. The betrayal was in the open, and no spin could erase the sound of his own daughter confirming the architecture of the silence Jasmine had just dismantled. Jasmine reached forward and turned off the recorder, sliding it back into her blazer pocket. "This isn't about me winning," she said quietly. "It's about the truth no longer losing." The red tally light still burned. The feed was still live, and the whole country had just heard a whisper from inside the family tower, one that might bring the whole thing down. By morning, the clip had already fractured the internet. On every platform, in every time zone, Ivanka's voice played on a loop. She knew. She handled it all. Daddy didn't even have to ask. Overlaid captions turned the words into banners. Hashtags multiplied. Kikash subpoena, the First Lady, Nekashin, best cover, Isa cause, Kashan silence, is her confession. Within 6 hours, the first hashtag trended globally. By 8, it was in 5 different languages. Cable news panels ran on repeat through the night, pausing only to replay the moment Jasmine slid the metadata report across the table. In some clips, they zoomed on Melania's eyes dropping toward it. In others, they played the audio of Ivanka over a slow pan of the Croatian resort brochure. No one needed a narrator. The pieces fit themselves. At the White House, the president emerged for a morning address. The cameras caught the defiance in his jawline, the stiffness in his shoulders, the way his hand hovered over the podium as though gripping for balance. "The First Lady is fine," he said, smiling tightly. "She's resting. This circus will end." Taborn. But even as the words left his mouth, reporters shouted the question that had already become unavoidable. "Where is she?" There was no answer, and the absence began to grow louder than any denial. By noon, crowds had gathered outside Capitol Hill. Some held signs painted in urgent black letters. "Truth wears heels," "No one above subpoena," "Silence is not grace." They weren't just political activists. They were mothers, veterans, college students, retirees who had watched the broadcast and felt something in them shift. Jasmine Crockett walked up the marble steps, her navy blazer catching the wind. The press swarmed, microphones angled, cameras flashing. She didn't break stride until she reached the podium, and when she spoke, her voice carried across the plaza and into the live feeds of millions. "Silence used to be her shield," Jasmine said, her tone steady, unhurried. "Now it's her confession." The crowd erupted, but she didn't pause for applause. "This isn't about who sits in the East Wing. It's about what happens when that seat becomes part of the machinery that hides the truth. I promised the women in those files that I would not let their stories end in a footnote, and today I keep that promise. Within the hour, the House Oversight Committee received the formal request. By mid-afternoon, the subpoenas were filed, not just for the First Lady, but for financial officers, former aides, and the directors of the Melania-style foundation. News tickers scrolled the headlines in bold red. First Lady subpoenaed in charity fraud probe. On split screens, legal analysts dissected the scope, campaign strategists measured the damage, and survivors of silence, women who had taken settlements years earlier, called in to speak for the first time. One appeared on live TV, her voice trembling but resolute. "I was one of them," she said. "Different foundation, same pattern. I thought I'd die with this secret. Last night, I realized I don't have to." Another wrote a public post attaching a blurred-out copy of her NDA with the caption, "No more." By dusk, it was no longer just Jasmine's case. It had become a collective unburdening, a nationwide reckoning with the cost of keeping quiet. Inside the West Wing, aides spoke in hushed tones. Some began packing personal items into discreet boxes. Aides loyal to the First Lady exchanged brief, anxious messages. "Have you heard from her?" The answer, again and again, was no. The president tried to project control. In closed-door meetings, he mocked the investigation, calling it a joke and a stunt. But every hour Melania remained unseen, the narrative slipped further from his grasp. The press tracked motorcades, scanned the windows of Trump properties, stalked the entrances of private clinics and luxury hotels. Still nothing. That night on the Capitol steps, Jasmine gave one more statement. The crowd was smaller now, the air cooler, the noise replaced by the hum of generators and the occasional click of a camera shutter. She spoke softly, almost as if to herself, but every microphone caught it. "Sometimes the greatest threat to power isn't a rival," she said. "It's a woman who refuses to be quiet." The words ran in headlines the next morning. They were printed on protest signs by afternoon. By evening, they were on T-shirts. Across America, one truth had settled in, the kind that didn't need another broadcast to survive. In politics, storms often come from the outside. A scandal, a rival, a crisis no one saw coming. But this one had bloomed from within the walls of the most guarded residence in the world. And the seed wasn't planted by a spy, or an enemy, or even a journalist. It was planted by silence itself, and watered every day by the belief it could never be broken. Now it had been, and no one could unhear it. In the end, it was never just about politics or power. It was about the quiet spaces where truth is buried, and the courage it takes to dig it back up. Silence can be a shield, but when it protects the wrong, it becomes a prison, for those who hide and for those who suffer unseen. The measure of a just society is not how it treats the powerful when they speak, but how it lifts the powerless when they finally find their voice. If this story made you pause, don't look away. Sit with it, share it, speak it out loud. Send it to someone who still believes silence should never be bought. Subscribe to Harrison Stories, where power is questioned and every buried voice gets its day in the light. Hit the bell, because the next revelation won't be comfortable. It's unfiltered, and it might just change how you measure integrity. This is a fictional dramatization, born from real patterns of injustice and the courage it takes to confront them. Any resemblance to actual people or events is either coincidental or symbolic, meant for public reflection and accountability. Thanks for watching. Truth isn't granted, it's fought for. This is Harrison Stories.